This is a production of Cornell University Library.
Thank you, Mary, for very nice introduction. And I feel like my head is like, 20 tons right now because the whole Mann library is just full of exhibits about apples and cider, and it's just so exciting. So it's a lot of fun to be here. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of apples and really more about cider and how cider has become such a popular drink of late. And then also talk to you a little bit about some work I've done with the folks at the Cornell Library System and also a collaboration with the Biodiversity Heritage Library, where we've been able to take a lot of the texts that Cornell owns, and particularly those that are in the rare collections, and give them some daylight, put them online and make them publicly available for people. So apples. Apples, our modern apple, our cultivated apple, our culinary apple is Malus domestica. So it's a hybrid apple. And the main progenitor of Malus domestica is Malus sieversii. And so the origin of apples really starts here in the Kazakh forests in Western Asia. And what happened is through human intervention and along the Silk Road, the apple was brought westward to Europe, where it hybridized, mostly with Malus sylvestris, a European crab apple, and that's how we get Malus domestica, our modern apple. And there's been a few other hybridizations along the way, and also other hybridizations that happened eastward. And so this is actually work that was done by colleagues over at the Boyce Thompson Institute. They just published this last year in Nature Communications, and it's really exciting that they finally were able to genetically fully understand the origin of our modern, of our culinary apple. This is what the forests look like in Kazakhstan. So some of the mountains are up to 24,000 feet. There's a huge range of diversity in terms of the genotypes of Malus sieversii here. So they grow in the lowlands, they grow on the hillsides, they grow up towards the tops of the mountains, they grow in wet soils and dry soils. So it's a source of tremendous genetic diversity for us as scientists. It's a place that there have been, after the Soviet Union collapsed and it was US scientists were able to go visit there. Scientists from the USDA and Cornell went and visited. They collected seeds, they brought them back, and we actually have collections of these plants in Geneva, New York, as part of the USDA germplasm collection. And I'll return to this thought in a few slides. And actually right here, we're actually the collection, this is a picture of some of the seedling trees from the seeds that were brought back from those collections to Kazakhstan. And you can see just some of the diversity in different colors and sizes of the fruit. So if you're interested in learning more about apples, and since we're doing a library talk, I'll introduce you to a few books that I really like. The Frank Browning book on the far left is a really nice introductory text to learning about the history of apple. He did a really fantastic job of this, making a very approachable historic context as well as some modern use of apples. The Juniper and Maberly book is a little bit more technical, but still very approachable. And if you're a little bit more geeky and you want to geek out on apples a little bit, I'd highly recommend that. It's not something that you're going to be reading a lot of scientific text, but it does talk a little bit more about the genetics. And then Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire, is also a fascinating read, because his argument is that not only are humans manipulating plants for our needs, but that plants are manipulating humans, in a sense, for their needs. And so I think, the story there is with apples is, apples were these wild crab apples, kind of unpalatable, very difficult to eat, unpleasant, and through human intervention was hybridized, and now we have this huge range of apples that we eat today. Talk a little bit about global apple production. The number one producing country for apples is China. They grow almost 60% of the world's apples. A lot of that is consumed domestically. and they also produce a tremendous amount of apple juice concentrate, and that actually does enter into the US market. So we see a lot of apple juice that we drink here, and in fact, probably some of the hard cider that is being made in the US is being made from apple juice concentrate from China. The United States is the second largest country, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, and then Turkey, Poland, and then it goes down the list. You'll see is that apples are produced in almost every country in the world, particularly in the temperate climates, but even in some subtropical countries where they are able to use elevation to their advantage and grow apples up on mountainsides and then be able to have some sort of seasonality so that the plants will experience a dormancy. So there's Ithaca, that's where we are today. Talk a little bit about apple production in the United States. The number one producing state in the country is Washington. They grow about 41%. The numbers there represent the percent of the total state, the total country's production of apples. New York is number 2 at 13%. And the areas highlighted in red are the areas of high concentration of apples. So the primary growing region for New York State is along Lake Ontario, and that's where they have the lake effect. So the large body of water helps to keep the air temperature cool in the spring, so it delays the bloom date so that the apple trees will bloom after most of the frost events have happened, right? And so for obvious reasons, that's a very good thing for growers. And in the fall, that large body of water holds on to the heat from the summer, and so it extends the harvest. And so you can have a longer growing season. And so that's why we see a tremendous amount of production along the Lake Ontario shore. We have a lot of apple production also in the Hudson River Valley. Valley effects also help with apple production, and for similar reasons of moderating temperatures. And then the third large growing region is along the upper Hudson River Valley to Lake Champlain. All these regions are experiencing a growth in hard cider production. We have just a few other little tidbits of facts. There's over 1,300 unique apple farms in New York State. So it's still a very important part of our economy, a very important part of our agricultural landscape, and more so with cider, really important part of economy, of rural economy for these communities, in the sense that there's agritourism, there's pick your own orchards, and there's a reason for people to leave the cities and go out and into these communities and spend some money. So cider, and it's sometimes a confusing terminology because cider can mean different things depending on the context. So the raw ingredient, of course, is apples. Sometimes those apples are concentrated into apple juice concentrate, and I talked about apple juice concentrate coming in from China. But the majority of well, not the majority, but apples are then pressed, processed into a liquid form. And in the US, if it's unfiltered, it's that brown juice that you would buy at, for example, the picture there of Cornell orchards. We call it cider. And so traditionally we called that cider. In England and other European countries, they refer to that as juice. And here in the US, what we call juice is that yellow, clear liquid, like the example there from Mott's, of a very filtered product. And so, you know, when I go to England and I say something about cider or hard cider, we always have to spend a little bit of time saying, are you talking about the fermented beverage? Are you talking about juice? What are you talking about? So cider is made through a process of fermentation. So very similar to the process for making wine out of grapes. Yeast can either be natural on the surface of the fruit, or oftentimes a commercial yeast strain is used, inoculated to the juice. And that yeast, what it's doing is converting sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide blows off, and it's the alcohol that we're interested in from a product standpoint. By legal definition, the U.S. producers can label a product as cider up to 8.5% alcohol by volume, ABV. So, but you can make other products from juice. You can make an apple wine, and that can be made from apples that have a very high sugar content that might naturally ferment to a higher than 8.5% alcohol content, or you can add sugar. You can chaptalize, and then you would have what's called an apple wine. And so we do have producers in the state that make apple wine. You'll still see it. Sometimes you'll see they have a range of different fruit types of wines, and apple wine is one of them. So sometimes it's naturally made, sometimes it's made by adding sugar, but legally, by taxation purposes, if it's over 8.5%, then it's called a wine. And then there's also ice cider, and that's where they actually concentrate the juice prior to fermentation. And so they do this in Quebec. They do this in a similar process to how ice wine is made. They'll allow the fruit to actually freeze on the trees out in the field, and then go out and harvest the frozen apples and then press them. It's a very difficult process, and it's very challenging because a lot of the fruit actually will drop to the ground before they actually get to harvest it, so they get a very low yield on it. More often when you see ice cider, what's happened is that they've taken the apples, they've pressed and juiced it, and then they freeze the juice. And then as that juice thaws, they collect that and that concentrated juice, and what's left behind is basically water, right? So with the higher solute content, it thaws first, and so they're able to collect that. With higher sugar content, equates to higher alcohol content. And so that's how they make dessert types of products, and they call them ice ciders. Apple cider vinegar is made from apple cider, so from the fermented product, and Acetobacter converts the alcohol to acetic acid, and that's how we get vinegar. And so there's a market for that, and if even if you spend 5 minutes Googling apple cider online, apple cider vinegar and all the health benefits of apple cider vinegar come up. It's a very popular product. It's gained a lot of attention as well. So I won't talk too much about apple cider vinegar today, but just a note that that's a product made from apple cider. And then there's several distillation products. So this is where we've, through using stills, have heated the product and concentrated the alcohol. And so you take cider at, say, 8%, 8.5%, and then you concentrate it to 70% alcohol, right, through distillation. And so the first product you get off of that is a clear liquid, and that's referred to as eau de vie, the water of life. And so you see a few producers with the advent, the growth of the cider industry. We've also seen a growth of the craft distillation industry as well in New York and around the country. And so you'll see some producers in New York State producing an eau de vie. Now, if you take that eau de vie, that clear liquid, and you put it into an oak barrel, and you let it age, it will get some of the brown coloring from the oak, and it'll also change the flavor profile. And over time, you'll have some evaporation, and you'll get down to about 40% alcohol, and you'll have a brown liquid, and that's apple brandy. And so in France, they call that Calvados. And so lucky enough to be there a couple weeks ago, and actually the two pictures there in the bottom are pictures of a still from one of the producers I visited, and then one of the now out of commission oak barrels that they use for aging Calvados. Some of those barrels they'll use for over 100 years, and so they just keep reusing them. And then there's another product called pommeau. And so we've got a handful of producers in the Finger Lakes actually making pommeau, and that's where you take juice and you blend it with cider, and so you go from a 40% alcohol content, and you blend it down till you get to somewhere 17 to 20% alcohol content. So a lower alcohol content, but a sweeter product because you have juice in there. And so it's a really nice product as an aperitif and really popular in France and gaining some traction here in the US. The cider you buy is largely, most of the producers in New York State and around the US are carbonating their ciders, but some are still, and you'll find some still products out there. Perry is another product. So Perry is just cider that's made from pears. And Perry's fabulous, but we won't talk too much about Perry today. And then hobbyists, if you want to make some, you want to experiment on your own, you can make up to 100 gallons for personal use, or as a whole household, you can make 200 gallons. So I think one of my grad students, Adam, has probably gotten pretty close to that mark. You still have some room? Okay. We'll keep working on that. And of course, it's alcohol in the US, whether it's cider, whether it's a distilled product, you need a license in order to commercially sell it. So you can make it for yourself, but you can only drink it with yourself and your friends. So a little history of cider. Pretty sure there were, as soon as there were people roaming through these Kazakh forests or even other places where apples were wild apple trees, different species of malice were being grown, they would pick up the apples off the ground well after harvest, and naturally the sugars would have fermented into alcohol. And I'm sure it was a very pleasant experience for them, as it is for us to drink cider. But it was really the Romans that spread cider throughout Europe. And so as the Romans moved northward and to the British Isles, and they tried to bring their grapevines, their vitis vinifera, the European wine grapes, and they found that they did not thrive in those climates. It was too cold. But they did find that the local populations were making a fermented beverage from apples. And so as the Romans went from the British Isles and they went through northern Europe, they brought that tradition of cider throughout Europe. And so they really spread it far and wide. And so by the 2nd century, it was pretty common throughout Europe to find cider production. One of the anecdotes about cider is that during the Industrial Revolution, when humans were doing terrible things to the environment and our water, our natural water was heavily polluted with pathogens because it was our source for drinking water, but also our source of sewage. And so they would use cider as a disinfectant. So they would often take some water and put some cider in it, low alcohol concentration, to kill the pathogens, and that was a really common way of having safe drinking water. So cider was fairly common throughout North America, or at least through the eastern US during the colonial period, all the way up through Prohibition. It was locally produced. A lot of farms would have their own trees. They might even have their own varieties that were locally adapted, had a lot of names that were locally well known. And the big change happened during Prohibition, right? So of course the temperance movement led up to Prohibition, and during that time we see cider go from this sort of populist beverage where it was very much so locally produced and people could have their own access to alcohol, to, after Prohibition, to be much more regulated and much more controlled. And after Prohibition, we also had some major demographic shifts in our country. So we had a huge amount of immigration of Northern Europeans coming into the city, and we also had a lot of our citizens moving from rural areas into urban centers. And so the Northern Europeans preferred beer, because that's what they were accustomed to. So Irish and German predominantly, that came over after, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. And then beer, because it's made from a grain, is a product that can be stored 12 months of the year. It can be easily transported. So it was easy for the beer manufacturers to scale up quickly to produce beer in the urban centers and make it available to consumers locally. And so while there's some anecdotes about every cider apple tree was being chopped down during Prohibition, that's probably inaccurate, and probably some of these demographical shifts that happened after Prohibition really led to the decline of cider production and cider consumption in the US. And it really wasn't until about 2010 that we saw this reemergence. So it's been legal to make cider since the end of Prohibition in the 1930s, but it really hasn't been until very recently that there's been this resurgence. And so wine didn't really start coming back into a product until about the 1970s, and we had the tasting of Paris, right, when the California wine producers brought their wines to Paris and put them up against the best French wines, and some of the U.S. wines were chosen as you know, better than the French wines, and it was this big, amazing sort of revelation that, hey, you can make New World wine and it can be fantastic. I think we're starting to now see, 30, 40 years after that mark of the Tasting of Paris, to start seeing cider gain that kind of traction as well. Globally, when we look at cider consumption, we can see that the United Kingdom is far and away the largest producer and also consumer of hard cider. The rest of Europe consumes about 21%, and then North America is about 10% of global cider production. But that's growing, and it's growing. This slide is probably about 2 years old now, and I would say I think we're probably in the low teens, maybe even mid-teens now in terms of consumption of cider. It's been really, really exciting to watch this industry grow. And this is how it's grown. We can see we currently have about 820 producers of cider throughout the United States. And that goes from, if we go back to 2010, only 146. So nearly 700 new businesses have opened up in the United States to produce cider in a very short time frame. And that growth is really exciting. It's also a little like, well, let's see what happens. We're seeing cider being produced in all 50 states. I had a gentleman visit me about a week and a half ago from Hawaii who is starting to make cider there. So they actually can grow some apples in the more mountainous regions of Hawaii. And so it's a small, he does a lot of different fermentation products, and he wants to make small batches of cider from some locally sourced apples. One other note on this slide here is that, similar to the slide I showed you where apples are being grown, you'll see that there's a lot of correspondence to where cider is being made. So Washington State, New York State, Michigan, where there are apples, we're seeing a lot of cider producers open. One of the side notes is, one of the really exciting things is that the next generation of farm family kids is actually going back to the farms now, and they want to open cideries. And so it's this change where there is this real attrition of the next generation wanting to leave their farm, wanting to leave that rural community, go to an urban center, go somewhere else. And now with cider, they're able to go back to the farm, have their own thing. It's not mom and dad's business, or I'm not going to be the fifth generation doing the same thing, but they're able to bring something back, add value to what the family is doing. And I've seen that story repeated over and over again throughout New York and throughout the United States, and it's really, really exciting and encouraging. If we look at the growth of cider in terms of production, this is data from the TTB. And so the TTB is responsible for taxing alcohol. And so that's our best indicator of the volume of cider that's being produced, right? Because Uncle Sam wants his cut. And similar, we can see from 2010 up to 2014 or 15, we see this huge increase, about a tenfold increase in cider production in the United States. So that's the gray line in the middle. The last 2 years, there's been a little bit of a decline. And I think what happened is that some of the large-scale producers that ramped up very quickly, in particular Angry Orchard, which was not making cider prior to 2010, right? So Angry Orchard is owned by Boston Beer Company, so they make Sam Adams. And so they started making cider in about 2010, 2011, and they just hit the gas pedal. They just started making cider. They had the ability to distribute far and wide because they already distributed their beer through those same channels. And I think they were a large source of why we see this huge increase in cider production throughout the U.S. And then in the last couple years, I think they've taken the foot off the pedal a little bit. But Some interesting facts: if we take the volume of cider that was produced in either 2014 or 2015, and we do a little bit of math on it, and we look at how many, the mass of apples that are produced in the U.S., the amount of cider made in the U.S. would have needed 7% of all apples grown in the U.S. So that's pretty tremendous, right? I mean, out of nowhere, all of a sudden, 7% of the apples. Now, it's not 7% of U.S. grown apples. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of apple juice concentrate that's being turned into cider in the U.S. So part of my research and some of the things that I'm working on is looking at how do we increase a domestic supply chain of cider apples, of the varieties that cider producers want in order to make the kinds of cider that they want. So some other statistics that while there's been a slight decline in the amount of cider sales from the large-scale companies, over the past several years, we keep seeing this increase in small and medium-scale craft producers. So that's really exciting, and that goes back to the thread about how cider is really helping in terms of economic development in rural communities. One of the big growth trends that's happening currently is rosé cider, and so you'll see that out in the marketplace, pink cider, right? Pink is in. And it's huge in cider too. And so some of that cider is being made from actually red-fleshed apples, and some of that cider is being made from regular cider, but then is colored with things such as hibiscus and other sorts of colorings. So if we look specifically at New York State has nearly 100 cider producers now. We have more cider producers in New York State than any other state in the country. We have very favorable laws for opening and starting craft cider production in New York State that Governor Cuomo has instituted, and that's helped to really promote cider production. We have two very large producers. We have Angry Orchards. They opened a research and development facility in Walden, and also Anheuser-Busch makes all of its Johnny Appleseed in near Syracuse. So we'll talk a little bit about cider and what the flavors are in cider. Of course, the first thing that you often taste in any beverage is the sugar content. And so if it has more sugar in it, it'll be sweet, and if it has less sugar in it, it's referred to as dry. And so you'll find the whole gamut in cider, from sweet to dry. And we have examples in the tasting out in the lobby after this talk of everything in between. The other major chemical constituent that you'll taste is acidity. And so the primary organic acid in apples is malic acid. And so that'll give it a tart, or what we refer to in the cider jargon is sharp flavor. It could also be sour if it's really, really high in concentration. And then there's tannins. Tannins are a subset of polyphenols. And tannins, just like in wine or in tea, are a group of compounds that lend themselves towards astringency and bitterness. And so when we think about the apples that are grown currently commercially in the United States, most of them are very low tannin concentration, right? Because it's unpalatable. We often refer to them as spitters if we eat them, to have an apple with a very high polyphenol content. But those apples with the high polyphenol content are the ones that are particularly useful for cider production because they lend themselves to creating a more robust product, a product with that with a bigger body, with more mouthfeel because of that astringency and that bitterness. And then, of course, there's a whole gamut of different volatile compounds in ciders. The classic system of trying to say, what is a cider apple, was developed over 100 years ago by researchers at the Long Ashton Research Station in the United Kingdom. And they basically used two criteria: the percentage of tannins and the percentage of acid in the apple, to say whether it was bitter, meaning high tannin, or sharp, high acid. So you have bitter sharps, high tannin, high acid; bitter sweets, high tannin, low acid; and then sharps, and then sweets, which were high acid or low acid with low amounts of tannins. So just relative to European wine grapes, apples have somewhere between 10 and 18% sugar content, Brix as it's measured in, whereas wine grapes tend to be 8 to 26% sugar content. Similar range of acidity, but different organic acids. And then culinary apples have a similar tannin concentration to red wine grapes, but the cider apples often have 4, and even some of them have up to 10 times the concentration of tannins than red wine grapes. So there's just some pictures of some of the different cider apples that we grow in some of our research plots. Dabinet is the most widely grown bittersweet apple in England. Brown snout is aptly named. You can see the little brown russeting on the calyx end. Porter's Perfection is a bitter sharp, so it has the tannin concentration and the acidity, and it also displays this really interesting anatomical feature called polycarpy. And so if you look at that apple that's right in the middle there, you'll see the two apples are fused together, and so that's a really common feature of this apple, Porter's Perfection. And that's an apple that's really gaining a lot of popularity with our cider apple growers in New York State. They really like it. It's horticulturally one that's easier to grow and also produces the juice quality that the cider makers want. And then on the far right is Gold Rush. So we've done a lot of work in my lab trying to figure out what apples should we be growing for the cider industry. And so one of the first projects that we did was to just take a look at, hey, what are the apples that are currently being grown that are being used for culinary uses or for processing, and how well suited are they for cider production? And so if we look at their acidity content, that point at which they would go from a sweet to a sharp is highlighted in red. So it's 4.5 on this scale here. And you can see the vast majority of the apples that we grow currently are already sharp. We have a lot of apples with a lot of acidity. So that's not really what we need in terms of if we're trying to develop a cider industry, trying to supply a cider industry with the raw ingredients that they need to continue to grow. What they need is more tannins, more apples with higher tannin content. And so this is looking at that. This is total polyphenolics, which is a proxy for tannin content. And we can see that even the highest apple in this list here, which is Harrison, which is an American heirloom apple, is about half of the tannin content that it would be needed for it to be classified as a bitter apple under the English system. And the majority of the ones in blue are the culinary apples, and you can see that they're only about 300 milligrams per liter, so that would be about 1/8 the percentage that they would need in terms of their tannin content to be considered a bitter apple. So we've been doing a lot of work trying to figure this out. Oh, what are the apples we should grow? And we have variety trials looking at English and French apples. We just planted a new planting of apple varieties from Asturias. We have some apples that we've imported from the Long Ashton Research Center from a breeding project they had in the late 80s. We're going to look at some Calvados apples in a couple years. And really, we're looking at over 40 different varieties. But here are some of the issues with them. Tremendous amount of fruit cracking on the far left. The picture in the top right middle there is sunburn. Bottom picture there is fire blight. It's a bacterial disease which is lethal to the apple plant. A lot of them will get these rots. That's Ellis bitter on the top, and you can see the apples rotting still on the tree. And that's even with a conventional fungicide program. What we call blindwood, which is long sections of the branch that don't produce any flower buds. So you get very low production from those sorts of trees, and very small fruit. A lot of these apples with high tannin content also are can be crab apples or related to crab apples, and so they're very small in size. And so it makes it very difficult to harvest them. And then here they are. They set these fruit in really these tight clusters. So it's a very different beast than what we're used to for growing culinary apples. A lot of challenges, a lot of horticultural challenges that we're trying to address in my research program. One of the really fun projects that we're working on That's Nathan, and he's a master's student in my program. Is we're going back to the collections. I mentioned the seedling trees from Kazakhstan being grown in Geneva. Well, that Geneva collection is a USDA managed facility, and they have about 3,000 different genotypes. And so we've been doing some data mining, we've been working with USDA scientists, and we've come up with a short list of about 300 varieties in that list that we think are suitable for cider production. And so Nathan's had the pleasure of last year, pretty much once, sometimes twice a week from August all the way to the end of November, going up to Geneva and collecting apples. And you can see in the bottom middle picture there some of the examples of some of the different genotypes. And so we're trying to screen through these and understand, hey, can we find some apples out there that have the juice characteristics, that have the chemical attributes that we want, but that we can also fit into the horticultural types of systems that we want for productivity. And so here's some of the results from his work. And so in the top yellow are the bitter, sharp apples, those that have high tannin and high acidity. And so now we're able to, with some of this work, target those apples and say, okay, which of those can we try to start growing in the field? Which of those might be adaptable to our modern sorts of orchard systems? Do a lot of work with understanding how to grow cider apples as well. So in wine, there's a tremendous amount of research on trying to understand how do things like crop load and light interception and rootstocks and water relations and nutrient relations, how does that affect the final product? How does that affect wine quality? And there's really only been a scattering of this sort of research over the past century in cider. So it's really exciting. It's an exciting field to go into because pretty much all the questions we ask are like, no one's really looked at this in depth, or no one's looked at this for almost 100 years. And so it's a lot of fun, but also it has led us to look at some of the older textbooks as well. I've been working with a graduate from Cornell's Dyson School over the past year, and we've been doing some economic case studies of cider apple production in New York State and try to say, hey, is it profitable to grow these apples, or are commercial apple growers are interested in growing these, but they want to know, are they going to make money doing it? And so the answer is yes right now, because the price is quite high for cider apples. And under a number of different horticultural systems, orchard designs, even management systems from conventional to organic, we're finding that all these orchards are achieving profitability. So it's pretty exciting. We're doing some more work and some more case studies to try to understand this. Okay, so back to the library. We, over the past year or so, been working with myself, with many members of the Cornell Library System, and also with the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which is a consortium of libraries throughout the world, and their mission is to basically digitize and make publicly available rare manuscripts, particularly those that have a biological context. So we've been able to work with them and take some of the collections in Cornell's holdings, some of which are in the Rare Manuscripts Library, which is, it's kind of, you need a special passcode and security clearance to go in. So these books are available to anybody who wants to look at them, but they're not that easy to get to unless you really know what you're looking for. And so we've been able to take some of those books and give them some daylight, and it's been really exciting. And with this collaborative project, we've built this new, or really they've built this new collection all about apples and cider. It contains 64 titles. There's almost 250,000 unique pages in this collection. And many of them have just fantastic illustrations. So a lot of the older pomology textbooks were about how do we identify apple varieties? How do we describe them? And so a lot of them contain these pictures that were drawn by hand or painted by hand. So here's an example. This is the Pomona herefordshire. This was produced in 1811 by Thomas Andrew Knight. And one of the great things about these pictures is that they drew everything, right? So not only did they draw the apple and the leaf, but they also draw, like in the middle yellow picture there, some russeting. In the top picture, we can see a little bit of apple scab. So they're showing the diseases, the good and the bad, all in these pictures. And just wonderful. And actually out in the lobby here, you'll see a lot of the prints from these, or several prints from these texts. This is another one. This was kind of a follow-up to that first text. This is the Herefordshire Pomona, and we actually have the original copy here. I think there were only about 600 or so produced originally, and we have one here in Cornell's holdings, and it's up here for you to look at. But you have to wear gloves if you want to touch it. And Sarah will be up front after the talk here, and she can show you some of these books. And we also have a reprint. So one of the uses for this, for my research program, is trying to identify some of these apple varieties, particularly some of the varieties that we're finding in the germplasm collection. Because cider was really a niche and a hobbyist sort of passion for people for many, many decades, there wasn't a lot of interest in always properly identifying these apples. And so what we found is even in the USDA's collection, and certainly in the commercial nursery trade, a lot of misnamed varieties. So people selling a variety as one thing, and it's really not that. And so one of the famous examples of this is Foxwhelp. And so one of the most well-known English cider apples, it's a bitter sharp, so it has tannins and it has acidity. And as far back as 1664, it was described as very good. And they knew back then that you had to age it in order to drink it. So it wasn't very good until some of those tannins mellowed out with aging until it became very good. In the United States, we have in the nursery trade a variety that's sold as Foxwhelp, but most of us in the know call it faux whelp, as the fake Foxwhelp. And so there is a picture of it on the right from the USDA collection, the faux whelp, and there's the original Foxwhelp from the 1811 text that I talked about. So it's really been great to go back to some of these texts and help us phenotype, help to identify some of these varieties to say, hey, what you think is Foxwhelp is not. And so it's been really quite useful from a practical standpoint as well as just from an aesthetic standpoint. So can't really talk about apple books in New York State, and particularly at Cornell, without giving kudos to the apples of New York. We have an example up here in the front as well. This was a text that was produced over 100 years ago by scientists, USDA and Cornell scientists based at the Geneva Research Station. And they described over 800 varieties, many of which they had paintings for, and some that were in black and white, and some that are in color. This is an example. This is Esopus Spitzenberg. So this is grown today as a cider apple, but Thomas Jefferson knew it back then and claimed it to be one of his favorites. And the lineage of understanding cider books and cider varieties continues. This is a newly released 7-volume set by Dan Busey, and he is describing 16,000 varietal listings. So many of which are synonyms, so apple varieties, the same genotype with more than one name, and that's also very common, right? And that happened historically, right? The people would share an apple tree, they would propagate these asexually through grafting, and they would grow it in 2 different places, and they would adapt a local name. So it was the same genetics, but all of a sudden it had another name. And so it's just really fun to see going back from the 1600s to just 2 years ago, and we're still doing the same thing. We're trying to categorize, identify, and illustrate apples. One of the other things that they did in this book is they highlighted a collection of watercolors that the USDA did from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And they hired about 20 artists, and they went around and they painted about 1,400 different watercolors. And they did mostly apples, they did peaches, they did grapes, they did strawberries as well. And these are all also available online for free through the USDA. And it's just beautiful stuff. So I want to give some acknowledgements to all the library folks. And I know this is only a handful of the people, and even today I've met some new folks who were involved in this project that I hadn't interacted with before. But it's been really just so much fun to go back and to be able to look at some of these texts, to bring them up, and to be able to use them for actual research purposes. I want to thank the Biodiversity Heritage Library, particularly Grace. If you're online, thank you. And she's been really fabulous in helping us organize this collection online and help to promote the exhibit through social media. Big thanks to my lab, of course, and you'll get to meet many of them out in the foyer for the tasting after. And please just go up and start talking. You can ask, are you in Greg's lab? And if you have some questions about apples that we don't have time to answer right now, please spend some time chatting with them. They're all fantastic graduate students and technicians, and we have a few undergraduate students from our summer internship program that we run at Cornell Orchards here with us today. And of course, I want to thank all the funding support I've gotten from numerous entities over the past several years. It's just been great to get that kind of support. I also want to give a big thanks. So I talked a lot about me and myself, but I'm part of a really large team of other researchers, educators, and extension specialists throughout the state who are working on hard cider. We're really building a huge team to try to deal with all of these new producers. 100 new producers in New York State trying to produce cider and learning how to grow apples, how to make cider, how to market it, learning about the laws and regulations. There's just so many questions to answer and so many things that we're looking at to try to fill the needs here. I also co-teach with colleague Kathy Arnick a cider production class, so we've just finished our second run-through of that. We offer that in the spring semester. We've had about 30 students go through the class each year, and they learn all about cider production, and they learn about the origins of apples and some of the topics that we've talked about today. And then my colleague Kathy teaches them all about fermentation and how to actually make cider. And so that's been really a lot of fun and becoming a very popular class. And I'd say we're not done yet. So in the production of this exhibit, we've come across some real gems of items. And so this is one that some folks from Mann Library were able to literally rescue from another office on campus, where these are watercolor prints of wild apples from Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan that were given to Cornell by Vavilov in 1932. So Vavilov was very famous, probably one of the most famous geneticists of all time, and he was working in Russia, and he came up with many very fundamental and important ideas about genetics, including the center of origin of plants, and also was a big proponent of crop diversity and having to save collections of plants for their use for breeding or just for understanding that genetic diversity. Unfortunately, most of his lab actually starved to death, is the story, trying to protect those seeds that they were collecting. So they were collecting all sorts of different crops. So he was lucky enough to come to Cornell in 1932 and gave a whole collection of these prints. So I think we're going to see some more about these coming down the road. And finally, after this, we'll have a tasting. And so here are some examples. All the ciders that you'll taste today are produced in New York. These producers are all sourcing apples within the state and for these products. And I think you'll just, I won't really say a whole lot about them right now and just let you go out and experience them. I do recommend trying several of them to try to understand the range. And if you're familiar with just a very sweet, apple-y type of cider, to try some of these, because these tend to be, we selected some that tend to be a little bit more dry, a little bit more wine-like. So with that, I'll take some questions.
Okay, you had a slide in the middle that had some figures on market share, wine, beer, apple cider, but I didn't catch the units there. I wasn't sure I understood the numbers.
So the U.S. beer industry is about $100 billion. The U.S. wine industry, this is in sales, the U.S. wine industry is about $35 billion, and the U.S. cider industry is about $1.5 billion.
Do you happen to know what that works out per person, per year? Or?
Oh, per capita consumption of
Yeah.
each of those products? I don't have that number off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
On the commercial side, as you've got Angry Orchard and other big players, is there an effect of the big players kind of driving the market, driving pricing to the point that the little players are almost kind of like the tail of the dog?
So great question. And do I need to repeat or is it all recorded? Good, okay. So there's a lot of discussion amongst cider producers of market segmentation and of pricing, and also of product identification. And so, producers who are making a product from apple juice concentrate, who can make it very inexpensively and making it at large volume, can sell a product at a much lower price point than those producers who are growing their own apples and making an estate type of product. And so, some of the craft producers say, hey, that's really driving our prices down. On the flip side, you could also say that some of these large cider companies are able to promote cider on national TV, on billboards, in popular magazines and newspapers, to put the cider into the marketplace everywhere. And so I think both are happening. And what's going to happen, what's the future of cider and the market? It's really, it's something that's evolving, and we're just going to have to watch and study. I think it's going to be something that we'll see that will turn out to be similar to wine, for example, right? So there's a big difference when you buy Chardonnay. You can buy Bock Chardonnay, and you can buy, Casson Montrachet, right? And they're night and day in terms of price, in terms of quality, but they're both Chardonnay. And so is the consumer confused by that? Do they not know that what they're getting when they buy one of those products or the other? So I mean, there's a lot more history with that, but I think we're going to see, as cider stabilizes and it becomes just a regular product that people buy. They'll go buy wine, they'll go buy beer, they might buy cider. There'll be a greater consumer understanding, but it takes time. Yeah.
Greg, does the Farm Brewery Act cover cider?
So the cideries are covered under a Farm Cidery Act. And so if you are a farm cidery, you have to source 100% of your raw ingredients from New York State. So with the exception if there is major regional crop failure. But which is a little different actually than the craft brew license, which does not hold the craft brewers to that same level of needing to purchase 100% of their barley or hops from New York State. So New York has a real advantage in the cider industry in that sense that we have this long tradition of apple production here.
I just want you to say a little bit, if you can, about how the craft cidery is mimicking or contrasting to craft breweries.
Oh yeah, good question. So there's all this back and forth between what's happening in the craft beer industry and the craft cider industry. And I think one of the really exciting things about the cider industry is that they're not held to the same level of tradition or conformity that the wine industry is. And so we're seeing cider producers experimenting more like beer producers do, craft beer producers. So they're adding hops to cider. They're adding all sorts of different adjuncts to them, giving them different flavors. They're playing around with all different kinds of yeast strains to try to give the ciders different flavors. We're seeing cider being one of the new things that's happened with the last couple of years, or cider is being packaged in cans, right? And so that was directly off of the craft beer movement where they started packaging in cans, and now you find really high-end craft cider being put into cans. And so it used to be cans were the low-quality product, and now it's really changed, and consumers are catching up and learning that, and many consumers actually really like that. So there's a lot of play and I think conversation back and forth between the industries. Yeah.
Two more questions?
Two more questions, okay.
Are you aware of orchards in New York State that are actually growing cider type of apples that are open to the hobbyists, open to the public?
So if you're a hobbyist and you want to try to get your hands on some of these apples, yes, you can. It's not easy, but certainly through conversation, you can. If you're local to Ithaca, we do sell some of our excess research fruit. And so hobbyists can purchase that fruit and get some of these European bittersweets and bitter sharps that we're experimenting with. Yep.
Is anyone producing an organic apple cider, and is Cornell studying ways to grow apples better for cider without using pesticides or chemicals?
So yes, there are organic ciders being made and sold in New York State. Some people label it as such, some don't, even if they're growing the apples organically. And that has to do with just what they think that the consumer is interested in seeing on the label. A whole other area of my research that we didn't discuss today is in organic apple production. And I've been studying organic apple production since about 2002. And in New York State, still about 1% of the apple acres are certified organic, very small amount. And that's because of the large pest and disease complex that we have here. And so we're hoping, and I've been working on this a long time to help to increase that. We certainly, New York State's short, geographic location, we're so close to all the population centers, Boston, New York, down to Washington, D.C. Those consumers want local, they want organic, and so we're really trying to come up with better ways or ways of growing apples organically to serve those markets. But it's a big challenge. But yeah, myself and many of my colleagues also work on, Cornell does quite a bit of work in organic apple production.
Well, let's give Greg another round of applause for a great talk.
This has been a production of Cornell University Library.